think we can all agree on one thing. The US military is terrifying, huge, advanced, powerful, and smart, but is it enough to take on the entire world? We're going to find out in this video. Personally, I think it is. But before we even jump into doing any of that, I got a sponsor to run by your ass. Before I even do that, though, I want to say thank you to you guys. Because of you, I got the sponsor. Because you guys watch the videos, I got a sponsor. So that's awesome. So I love you. Thank you. Guys, I have teamed up with DraftKings to bring you an offer you cannot refuse. Well, you can, but you will not want to. If you are a new customer of DraftKings, and if you use code Couser on sign up, you're going to get an extra $50 in casino credits when you deposit $5. That's crazy. With DraftKings, you're going to have all your favorite real money casino games right at your fingertips. Over 300 games to be exact. Blackjack, roulette, and even live dealer games whenever suits you. And may I add that DraftKings to date has given out over 100 million in jackpot winnings. That is crazy. And if it happens that tragedy strikes and DraftKings is not available in your area, you can still download the DraftKings Daily Fantasy app to have a shot at winning real cash prizes all season long. All you gotta do, head straight into the app and on sign up, use my promo code Couser, like it says at the bottom of the screen. And when you deposit $5, you're gonna get $50 instantly. Just like that. Good luck.
A superpower is defined as a state with the ability to exert influence or project power on a global scale.
Gotta take my shoes off for this.
In more than one region of the globe at a time. The United States, currently the world's sole superpower, fits this description, with an official military doctrine that states its military forces must be ready and capable to fight two major theater wars simultaneously, a capability no other nation on Earth can even approach. But what would happen if the United States found itself in a war against the entire rest of the world? How would that war potentially play out? The rules of this war game will be as follows. No nuclear weapons allowed, and war will be simulated to have broken out after weeks of preamble. As in a surprise attack, the United States with its forces spread around the world would likely lose its non-homeland forces entirely, but not before delivering crippling blows to most of the world's major powers and knocking them out of the conflict early. The US's main opposition would be in the form of a European coalition to include Russia and a China-India alliance. The rest of the world's contribution would be mostly in material supplies or financial backing, as while even nations like Japan boast a formidable military capability, they mostly lack the ability to actually deploy that power outside of their own borders. In fact, that would be the biggest hurdle.
Does Africa have an army? Why have I never heard of the African army? Is that a thing? And what about like Brazil? Do they have armies or nah?
To any global offensive against the United States. With historical military preparations focused on conflicts such as NATO versus Russia or China versus India, most militaries around the world lack the ability to transport military hardware across the oceans in a meaningful quantity, making a decisive assault against the US homeland impossible. Meanwhile, due to its commitments to fighting wars well outside its own borders for the last 80 years, the United States operates the world's largest air and naval transport fleets that number in the hundreds of ships and aircraft, more than most modern nations combined. This lack of mobility will prove to be a major weakness for the global alliance and severely hinder their ability to respond to US actions. Today, the United States operates its forces in every geographic area of the world and has split its command structure into 9 combatant commands, 6 responsible for global geographic areas of responsibility.
US Southern Command, the US Africa Command. That's fucking crazy. They're everywhere. What do you guys think? Before we get to the conclusion of this video, do you think that the United States military could take on the whole world? Let me know in the comments right now before you watch this, in case you don't know the answer already.
In the weeks leading up to the outbreak of war, the United States would likely pull its forces out of Europe and non-American bases in the Pacific, disbanding its European, African, and Southern commands. Pacific Command, Northern Command, and Central Command would absorb these forces. Battlefield 1, Middle East. US Central Command would receive an influx of former European assets, with the US bolstering its forces in the Middle East and bases in Afghanistan and Iraq with one goal: destroying the major oil refineries and distribution centers while denying access to the sea lanes that transport oil from the region. 81% of the world's oil reserves are located in OPEC countries, and over 60% of the world's oil passes through the Arabian Sea alone.
What the hell's an OPEC country,
the US's
brother?
strategic goals would be simple: shut off the global oil tap. With the world's 12th largest oil reserves, the United States could easily supply itself while denying the rest of the world access to vital Middle East oil. Europe, which would represent the United States' most formidable adversary, relies on Middle East oil for 40 to 50% of its total annual use, meaning an American stranglehold on the region would cripple any European war effort as reserves run out and their economies begin to collapse. China would face a similar problem.
Yeah, isn't that kind of crazy though, how the whole world depends on oil? Like literally, if you took away oil from countries, their whole economy would collapse very quickly. Isn't that quite insane that that little liquid is what literally keeps your entire country going, the entire world?
As 50% of its total oil imports all come from the Middle East, making the region the first front in our war. At the outbreak of war, the United States would first strike at oil production and distribution facilities across the Middle East via carrier-based strike aircraft backed up by former European theater aircraft, now based off American bases in Iraq and Afghanistan. With the world's largest air tanker fleet and flanking the all-important Persian Gulf from both Iraq and Afghanistan, American aircraft could penetrate deep into Middle East territory with impunity, striking at targets from the Straits of Hormuz all the way to the Suez Canal itself. Though regional forces would be able to offer some initial resistance, most operate outdated Soviet-era or non-modern American-built aircraft, with the exception of current US allies such as Saudi Arabia, who would be able to field modern variant F-15s, Typhoon Eurofighters, and Italian-British Tornado multi-role strike aircraft in small numbers. Without European support, however, the air war would go very poorly for Middle East powers for several reasons. Firstly, lacking a joint unified command, each nation would be unable to coordinate its air assets with its neighbors, resulting in confusion and low sortie rates. Most Middle East powers also field very few electronic warfare or early warning and control aircraft. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Israel would represent the most formidable threats to American air power, yet neither nation fields dedicated electronic attack aircraft, while the US is equipped with over 200, mostly F-35 variants and EA-18G Growlers. Without adequate numbers of AWACS and electronic warfare assets, Middle East powers would be unable to coordinate the large amounts of sorties needed to counter US air power, and they'd find their aircraft and ground-based air defenses actively jammed or spoofed by American EW assets. In the opening days of the Middle East War, the US would likely see moderate casualties among its air forces, as it would be mostly operating against obsolete aircraft and disorganized or inexperienced air forces. The greatest threat to US craft would come from ground-based air defenses, which range in obsoletism, yet remain a formidable obstacle to US air power. With a concentration of American
I was going to say, what's all this based on though? Because if a war actually started, each country is going to have probably the tactics and shit, you know what I mean? So it's easy to put a video out like this and say, yes, we'll win because we have more of this. But it's not taking into consideration tactics and stuff, maybe? You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Power in the region, it's a foregone conclusion that Middle East powers would have begun to move their air defenses to protect vital oil shipping routes and manufacturing/distribution centers. Yet Desert Storm proved how effective the United States can be at dismantling a nation's air defense network, and most nations in the region have invested little into modernizing their defense infrastructures in the years since. The US would suffer most of its losses to its fourth-generation aircraft such as its F-15, F-16, and F-18s, while its fifth-generation F-35s and F-22s would prove much more difficult to contend with. With an inventory of 385 active F-35s, over 1,800 more on order, and 197 F-22s, the US retains the only operational fifth-generation air fleets, with current allies fielding a token force of F-35s purchased from America, and the Russians and Chinese still not fielding combat-ready fifth-generation aircraft. Despite its technological and operational superiority, however, sheer numbers would present a threat to American forces. So instead of seizing key oil production or distribution facilities, the US would instead focus its efforts on keeping those facilities and trade route choke points shut down while defending against attacks on its air bases. A single sunk supertanker could block the Suez Canal for weeks, shutting down one of the most important oil trade routes in the world, while constant harassment by American air power would make the Straits of Hormuz impassable. With few major naval threats in the Pacific, American Pacific naval forces would be split between containing China and bolstering US Central Command forces in establishing a blockade of trade routes across the Pacific and Indian Oceans.
Would there even be any on-foot war though these days? It's just going to be all in the air, isn't it? I feel like that's how wars have advanced from like back in the day, like World War II, World War I, etc., Vietnam even. Like I feel like a lot of the wars then was basically on foot, but now like you don't really need like on-foot soldiers in a way. if you're that controlling. Like, America literally has over 1,800 fucking F-35s, I think it was, on order. There'd be absolutely no need to put anybody on the ground. Oh, kinda.
With 20
right?
carriers,
No?
11 of which are super carriers, more than the rest of the world combined, a blockade of the Indian and Pacific Oceans would be easily achieved. With a staggering 80% of global oil trade passing through the Indian and Pacific Oceans, the rest of the world would be forced to abandon any plans to attack the US homeland and first try to dislodge the Americans from the Middle East. Yet they would be doing so while operating on a ticking clock as domestic oil reserves begin running dry. In a prolonged conflict, immediate development of oil reserves in Russia would begin, though with only 80 billion barrels of proven reserves versus over 800 billion in the Middle East, it would be imperative for the global coalition to dislodge the US from the region or face eventual...
There's 800 billion barrels of oil in the... How big are the barrels? How big are the barrels? 800 billion! Holy...
oil starvation and defeat. Europe would be faced with the difficult decision of committing the majority of its air and naval power to a Middle East campaign, yet with an American Navy...
That's me right there. I'm right there. I'm absolutely fucked.
Larger than the next 8 navies in the world combined, they would be doing so at the risk of leaving their coasts vulnerable to harassment from American attack submarines and carrier strike groups. American attack submarines in particular would prove to be an overwhelming force, with 55 nuclear attack subs alone.
Jesus.
Europe, to include Russia, fields nearly 100 submarines, yet only about a third of those are nuclear powered and range from 10 to 25 years behind US subs in tech. Lacking in major transport capabilities and the ability to adequately protect...
This is a bit off topic, but any of you guys ever seen a movie called Black? And it's about, I think it's got Jude Law in it, and he gets a submarine and a bunch of guys to go down and find all this gold at like the bottom of the sea. It's good. It's claustrophobia inducing, nightmarish goodness though. Like, so damn good. Very good show.
Either their sea lanes or any attempts to move troops by sea, the global coalition would be extremely hard-pressed to dislodge the US from the Middle East. While an eventual overwhelming of US ground forces would be possible, it would take weeks of buildup and slow moving of forces via ground routes to avoid American submarines. Victory in the Middle East would be possible for the global coalition, but would only come at great expense of dwindling oil reserves, and any attempts to reopen the Middle East trade routes would certainly fail, as the US would concentrate its nuclear attack subs and carrier battle groups in the region. The coalition would be forced to rely on existing land-based pipelines, though these would not be enough to sustain the world economy, and the United States would certainly commit its stealthy B-2 bombers to the destruction of these pipelines and any attempts at building new ones.
Bombers.
In short, a land victory would be probable for the global coalition, but without the ability to challenge the US Navy, global trade routes would be permanently shut down, effectively crippling the economies of coalition nations and the war effort. Battlefield 2, West Pacific. The West Pacific and South China Sea is the most economically important waterway in the world, with a full 1/3 of all global trade passing through the area, or about $5.3 trillion.
Oh my.
China, South Korea, and Japan would especially have a vested interest in keeping these sea lanes open, yet none of those nations field a true blue water or deep ocean navy. In a global war, the United States would invest the majority of its expeditionary firepower.
Yo, Brian never knew Australia was that close to China, brother. Holy shit. I know it's not that close, but like, it's kind of there, like, isn't it? You know what I mean?
In the West Pacific, having little to fear from an Atlantic incursion by European powers due to their lack of major military transport capability and navies designed for decades to engage Russian ships in literal combat rather than blue water operations. Japan would pose a significant challenge for US forces due to its very modern and robust self-defense forces, yet the island nation could be largely ignored due to Japan's lack of air tankers, limiting the range of its strike aircraft and 70-year self-defense military doctrine, which saw the nation only recently begin to build an expeditionary capability. With 155 F-15s making up the bulk of Japan's air force and only a combat range of 790 miles, it is doubtful the island nation would risk its 5 operational airborne refueling tankers.
Japan's tiny. I never realized it was that small. Hold on, let me look at the world again. I know this is probably not an exact... Okay, it's not that small. It's larger than the UK. Okay, it's not that small.
To accurately target a US Navy vessel to within 10 kilometers anywhere in the Pacific. The US would certainly seek to counter this capability with deployment of its its anti-satellite weapon systems, of which it remains extremely secretive about. It is impossible to infer just how effective US anti-sat weapons truly are due to a lack of information, but it is known that in the early 2000s, the US Air Force successfully tested a deployment of mini-sats designed to kill or hijack enemy satellites, and in 2008, the US successfully targeted and destroyed a defunct satellite with an SM-3 missile launched from the USS Lake Erie in the Pacific.
That's insane.
With every US destroyer and cruiser able to carry the SM-3,
they're literally shooting down satellites from a boat in space.
This could potentially pose a serious threat to Chinese space assets and degrade the capabilities of their ballistic missile forces. In a push into the Pacific, however, the US would still suffer heavy casualties among its fleet due to Chinese long-range missile strikes. It's probable then that while it works to destroy Chinese space assets from afar, America would instead send its nuclear attack submarine fleet to blockade Chinese waters. China operates about 60 submarines, yet for years, those subs did not go on patrols or even leave port as they were often sidelined by maintenance issues. Only as recently as 2011 did Chinese subs actually begin to leave port, giving US subs the opportunity to tail them and discover that Chinese submarines were surprisingly easy to find and track due to their noisy nature. Defense experts estimated that Chinese sub technology was 10 years behind Russia and about 20 years behind the US. The US, meanwhile, operates 55 nuclear attack submarines, with most of these being of the modern Virginia class. Armed with torpedoes and a complement of Tomahawk cruise missiles, Virginia attack subs could easily threaten Chinese surface and subsurface vessels.
Where's the windows? Surely there's no windows on a submarine, bro. What the fuck is that?
And join its Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines in cruise missile attacks against Chinese inland industrial and military installations. While in recent years, China has invested heavily into improving its anti-submarine warfare capabilities, it is still critically behind even regional powers such as South Korea and Japan, meaning that in the end, there is likely little China could do to stop US attack subs. Though it could likely keep American carrier battle groups out of the South China Sea for the first week or two of the war, China would be helpless to prevent a naval blockade by US attack subs. India, also reliant on South Pacific trade routes, would certainly dispatch its naval forces to attempt to break a US blockade, but would face the same issues in challenging US subs that China would. Having only 15 active submarines and also lacking in modern anti-submarine warfare capabilities, the Indian Navy would quickly find itself overpowered by American attack subs. Employing a combination of its submarine and anti-satellite assets, the US would likely break through the Chinese...
Ireland probably sound like a couple of rowboats, bro. Couple of stones thrown. We probably don't even have a submarine.
Chinese ballistic missile shield within 30 days and enact a complete blockade of the South Pacific, strangling regional powers economically. With a blockade of Middle East oil exports, the global war would then become a war of attrition, with the US starving out the world's major powers while able to sustain itself off its own domestic oil reserves. Having little to fear from a European transatlantic offensive due to Europe's lack of major military transport capabilities, American forces would be free to initiate ground offensives against Canada and Venezuela in order to seize its oil reserves as well. Ultimately, the US Navy, the largest and best equipped in the world, would be the deciding factor in a global war. With such overwhelming firepower superiority, the United States would be able to fight defensively and without launching any major ground offensives outside of North America. Fielding a larger fleet than the next 8 navies combined, the US Navy, backed by the US Coast Guard, could easily defend the Atlantic sea lanes from any European incursion, while enacting blockades of major oil shipping routes through the Persian Gulf and Indian and Pacific Oceans. While the world would eventually be able to muster a large enough force to threaten the US, current military capabilities across the globe would be insufficient to prevent these naval blockades and would require years of buildup and expansion of navies from every modern nation. With the majority of global oil trade shut off by naval blockade, however, European and Asian economies would quickly shrink or outright collapse, making such a buildup improbable and ensuring an eventual US victory. Yet that victory would come at a titanic cost to even the US's own economy, and in the end, the entire global economy would likely shrink.
So let's not do it then. There's no wars ever again, because nobody wins in war. But I'm going to take from that video that the US would spank everybody's bottom.